good evening, wherever you are joining us from for today. Welcome to Panel B of Session 3 of the Philippine International Quincentennial Conference. I am Dr. Marcelino Macapinlac Jr. or Noy, and I will be your moderator for today's panel entitled Hispanic Way of Life and Muslim Mindanao. We are currently live on almost 100 Facebook pages, primarily at the National Quincentennial Committee, Department of Foreign Affairs, and other foreign service posts, National Historical Commission of the Philippines, and the National Commission for Culture and the Arts, among others. For those of you who were here yesterday, I'm sure you will agree that we had a great panel of speakers and moderator. I am certain that most of us, if not all, became more enlightened and inspired by the talks presented by Panel A, or Visayan Society in the 16th Century, composed of Dr. Jose Buenconsejo, who presented his paper on the parity and the act of recognition between Magellan and Humabon in 1521. Ms. Kina May Kwan, who talked about Liwan, investigating the colonial curtailing of the tattooing practice of the Visayans in the early Spanish period. And Dr. Rolando Borinaga, who discussed Hayahay, the plunder and breakdown of Visayan economy and society at the Spanish contact. Kudos to them and the amazing moderator, Mr. Edgar Alan Sembrano, or EA Sembrano. So today, we will continue with the presentation of another distinguished panel composed of some of the brightest academicians in the Philippines and Spain. To introduce this panel, I would like to call on the convener of Session 3, none other than the President of the Philippine National Historical Society, or PNHS, Dr. Bernardita Reyes Churchill. But before her introduction of the panel, please allow me to read to you her bio note. This is exciting. Bernardita Reyes Churchill was a longtime faculty member of the Department of History of the University of the Philippines, with appointments as Professor of History and Chair and Professorial Lecturer prior to retirement. She also held appointments as Professorial Lecturer at De La Salle University Graduate School and the University of Santo Tomas Graduate School. She currently serves as President of the Philippine National Historical Society and President Emeritus of the Manila Studies Association and the Philippine Studies Association. She is currently Chair of the International Council of Philippine Studies Conferences, or ICOPHIL, which convenes the International Philippine Studies Conferences. ICOPHIL 2020 at the Universidad de Alicante, Spain, was canceled because of the coronavirus pandemic, but will be rescheduled in more propitious times. She has received numerous honors, including as First Philippine Studies Teaching Fellow in the Faculty of Asian Studies, Australian National University in Canberra, Australia, an Outstanding Book Award as co-author of the Philippine Senate by the Philippine National Academy of Science and Technology in 1997. The Centennial Award, the recognition of her distinct contribution to women's visibility in history and nation building from the Philippine National Centennial Commission in 1999. And as Historian Special Award from her province of Cavite in 2004. Natatanging bayaning mamamayan ng Cavite sa larangan ng kasaysayan. Her publications focus on the Philippine colonial periods, Spanish, American, and Japanese, including studies on the Philippine Revolution, 1896 to 1898, Philippine historiography, and local history. She is executive editor of the Journal of History, publication of the Philippine National Historical Society, and Filipinas Journal of the Philippine Studies Association until 2020. She served as vice head of the Committee on Historical Research, National Commission for Culture and the Arts, or NCCA-CHR, from 1998 to 2004, and is currently member of the UNESCO Philippines Memory of the World Committee and chair of the Technical Committee for History of the Technical Panel for Social Sciences and Communications of the Commission on Higher Education. Dr. Churchill received a BA in History, magna cum laude, from the University of the Philippines, MA in Southeast Asian History from Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, and a PhD in Southeast Asian History from the Australian National University in Canberra. So let us all welcome with our virtual applause the living legend, Dr. Bernardita Reyes Churchill.
Thank you, Noy. This is the first time that I have heard me introduced the way you did. Thank you very much. I would have wished not have been introduced so very lengthily, but it's nice to hear what I have done for the last so many years. Good evening, Philippines. Oh no, good morning, Philippines. Good evening from Washington, D.C., which is where I am at the moment, stranded by COVID-19. It is an honor and privilege that PNHS, the oldest association of historians in the Philippines, dating from 1941, so we're 80 years old, is participating in this once-in-a-lifetime quincentennial celebration commemoration, situating the Filipino and the Philippines in the historical events of 1521. The PNHS panel, the formative years 1565 to 1665, picks up the history of the commemoration of this nation of islands of our pre-colonial ancestors, which transformed into the colony of Filipinas through the instrumentalities of church and state applied to the indigenous communities of the archipelago. It was a two-way process of political and cultural challenges, assimilation and appropriation, at times outright resistances in the process of becoming Filipinas and Filipinos. In presenting our story, we get a glimpse into our ancestors in the earliest ethnographic publications, first and foremost being the Boxer Codex, and then missionary chronicles, as well as documentary sources. It was explained earlier that panel A was held yesterday, so we now go to panel B. Panel B presents some of the structures and institutions developing during this early period of Spanish colonial rule, which became the enduring intangible and tangible cultural heritage of Filipinas. Among them, the ubiquitous stone churches that dot the islands, some in the style called earthquake baroque. I don't know if Ricky approves of that. Tribute to the missionizing labor of Spanish and Indian religious, educational institutions from the primary level, including schools for girls, a system of land ownership and private property, which prefigured Filipino society and developed an upper social class, and Islam culture and tradition reflective of the multicultural character of our country and people. The speakers for today are Regalado Trota Jose, raise your hand, tracking down architecture from the first 150 years of the Dominicans in the Philippines, 1587 circa 1700. Maria Eloisa P. de Castro, examining the foundations of a school culture in early Spanish Philippines, 1565 to 1715. Grace Lisa Concepcion, indigenous landowners in the 17th century Philippines, and Isaac Donoso, our import from Spain, Islamic mission in the Philippines in the early modern era. I turn it over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Churchill. So our first speaker obtained her undergraduate, graduate, and postgraduate degrees from the University of Santo Tomas, where she is currently an associate professor in the Department of History, Faculty of Arts and Letters. In 2019, the National Commission for Culture and the Arts gave an individual research award to Dr. De Castro for her work on Philippine secondary education in the Spanish colonial period, 1865 to 1898. She is a member of the Board of Trustees of the Philippine National Historical Society. So let us all welcome with our virtual applause, Dr. Maria Eloisa P. De Castro.
Thank you, Noy. Thank you very much. So I think my slides would be shared. Okay, thank you very much, Alec. So the title of my presentation this morning, good morning to everybody. Thank you very much to the NQC for this opportunity to participate in this conference and to the Philippine National Historical Society. So the title of my presentation is Examining the Foundations of a School Culture in Early Spanish Philippines, 1565 to 1785. By way of an introduction, next slide please. By way of an introduction, I would like to invite you to review our idea of education. Most books about the history of education in the Philippines equate the establishment, the beginning of education with the establishment of a school building. Sometimes it is also equated with the drawing up of the official documents which are signed by the founders, such as the one of Santo Tomas, no? The Colegio de Santo Tomas. So in other words, this idea of education is referenced or is always tied to the idea of formal education, having a school building and then having formal classes. When in fact, I don't think that that should really be the beginning of. I mean, we should reconsider this perspective, because I think the idea of education begins even before the actual school building or the papers would be signed. No? So next slide, please. So I have three reasons. Next slide, please. Okay, thank you. I have three reasons why I would like to revise, or I think that our idea of education, especially in the early Spanish period of the Philippines, should be revised. First, because I think that the act of teaching or the act of educating someone is integral to the evangelization process. Second, because I also think that educating the natives, or the process of education, is embedded in the encomenderos' duties and responsibilities. And third, you have the fact that education was not really confined to the classroom or the school setting. Let me explain each of these. Next slide, please. So in the first reason, I said that it's an inherent part of evangelization, right? So the process of teaching cannot really be separated from evangelization or the conversion to Christianity or to Catholicism. Why? Because it would usually begin with teaching adults or children catechism. So the teaching them prayers, the sacraments, and inevitably there would also be lessons in music. They would be taught how to sing, how to chant, no? So even music performance, no? The use of instruments. And then later on, Bible verses would be read, and then stories, no? In Latin. And of course, after 1582, this would be done entirely in the Philippine languages, because the Synod of Manila officially decided that the evangelization in the Philippines would be done through the native languages. No? And so everyone is welcome, adults and children. There is no particular preference. There's no class distinction. The nobles, the datus, the ordinary people, male, female, young and old, everybody would be, anyone who would be willing to learn would be accepted. And in this sense, the influence or the role of the local leaders would also be very important, because the local leaders, if they agree to be converted or accept conversion, would also be able to influence a large number of the local population. And in the process of evangelization, a process of conversion, reading and writing would also be inevitably taught. because this would become necessary skills, especially when the natives would be trained by the missionaries to assist them in the conversion process. So the natives were the assistants, and so eventually they learned how to read, how to write, and to basically stand in for the missionary if the missionary could not be there. So next slide, please. So the second reason I think that why we should revise education is because the educational process is part and parcel of, it cannot be separated from the encomendero's role. For this, I would quote Father Horacio de la Costa and his Jesuits in the Philippines, where he said that there are specific services that are part of the encomienda grant, no? So and the royal ordinances, which are services concerning justice, defense, and religious instruction. So I highlighted that. And then he goes on further to say that an encomendero should, as soon as possible, obtain the services of a missionary to instruct the natives, providing him a house and a subsistence allowance specified in the laws. And then in Father Schumacher, in one of his works, I think the Growth and Decline collection of essays, he also said that if there is no missionary available, then it should be the encomendero himself who would take it upon himself to educate the natives in terms of Christian life and Christian doctrine. So he becomes the teacher himself. This is required. This is part of what is asked of him when he accepted the encomienda, no, from the royal government. Next slide, please. So the third reason that I have for asking, a revision of the way we understand education is that there was no prescribed place. It doesn't mean that because there's no classroom, there is no schoolhouse, that education cannot take place. Actually, it did. In the early days of colonization, it was carried out in any place that was deemed suitable. And what do we mean by that? In any place that would be commodious enough to accommodate all of those catechumens, as they say, all of those persons who would be willing and ready to learn and to accept Christianity. No? Usually, this also would be outside the temporary domicile, the temporary house of the missionary, or sometimes if the missionary is able to meet the local leaders and the elders of the different settlements, they would agree to establish a specific site for a future pueblo or settlement. No? In the Jesuit areas, which would be the Visayas, Samar, Leyte, Bohol, and some parts of Iloilo, like Arevalo, no, the Arevalo area, there are crosses that are put up by the missionary, and it is described as the place where people meet, gather, and the place where they are also instructed. Excuse me. And then, of course, much later, because there would be no buildings yet, as evangelization proceeded and developed and progressed, there would be the addition of a schoolhouse, dormitories, and so on. Especially for the Jesuit areas, the dormitories or the boarding houses would be an important feature of this mission areas. No? Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So I would like to define, no, because I'm going to examine the foundations of a school culture. So I'd like to define first culture, and from there proceed with what I mean by the term school culture. So culture, I chose a very simple definition, which is that culture refers to the ideas and physical objects or things that represent a group or society. So here, when you say, I'd like to focus on two parts, no, the non-material and the material objects, no, and that represent a group, no. So the group here would naturally represent Spaniards and, of course, Christians, no, Catholics specifically. And then society, this would be Spanish society, Spanish culture. So when I say examining the foundations of a school culture, I'm actually referring to non-material features. This is what Sir Jojo yesterday referred to as the speech by physical things, no? When he quoted Giambattista Vico, no? The speech by non-material things, non-material features such as thoughts, beliefs, rites, rituals. Non-material features would refer to thoughts, beliefs, teachings, rites, rituals, which included teaching methods, educational standards, and then the material or the tangible features, which was, as I pointed out, these articles would conduct speech by physical things. No, so this refers to the actual material objects such as the cross, the rosary, the Bible, books, a schoolhouse, desks, chairs, etc. No, so in other words, what I'm trying to show here is that education brought knowledge not only about the religion itself, but also about the culture within which it was introduced, and that would be Spanish culture. So all of that would be tied. No, next slide, please. So here, how did the process of education take place? In the beginning, please remember that the period I'm discussing is from 1581 up to 1765, and naturally there would be no schoolhouses yet. No, so the main points that would be taught would be beginning with prayers, of course, as I mentioned, then progressing to the sacraments, the rites, usually the rites that are associated with the Eucharist or the Holy Mass. And as I pointed out before, music, especially performance, the introduction of the use of certain musical instruments would be eventually part of it. The chanting, no? So Gregorian chant, and then Bible lessons would also be given. And as I said already, reading and writing would be taught. This would be inevitable because they would be reading from the Bible, especially if the missionary would request one of the natives to assist him, then it's necessary that the native would know how to read. And eventually writing because of the communications that would be necessary, especially when the missionary would need to record many things, especially for his reports, the annual reports. So he would always need an assistant, especially since in the first 10 years of the Jesuit arrival in the Philippines, there were very few of them. This is what Father Colin said, and also Father de la Costa. They said there were very few Jesuits, so they could hardly move in terms of evangelization. So they actually really needed people who would help them. So inevitably, the languages would be learned, which would be Spanish, especially for those working closely with the missionary. There would be people who would learn how to speak Spanish, and eventually this would also become the interpreters, the first interpreters needed very badly in order to penetrate specific cultural communities that would be isolated or would be in the mountains. And of course, a certain level of Latin, because Latin is the language of the Mass, no, and of Christianity at that time. Now, also, inevitably, there would be some knowledge about acquired from canon law, especially when the missionaries would quote, would also give examples, no, and would explain the rules, no, that would be followed by the Catholic Church, and of course also the royal laws that would need to be followed by the missionaries, and they are introducing the laws, especially the laws on tribute and so on, to the Indios. Now, this would be the main things that are taught, but collaterally, there would be others that would come into play. There would be others that would be taught, such as, of course, that they would be encouraged to settle in a pueblo. And this is what I think Dr. Dumol refers to as becoming a citizen, no? The policia, no? Becoming, being introduced to civilization in the sense that he becomes a citizen, no? Becoming a part of the policia, settled in a pueblo. The pueblo is usually constructed around the church. So there is a church, a chapel first, no? Chapel, usually beginning with Nipa Ikanya. Inevitably, it's very simple, very very what made from available materials in the area, which is usually nipa and bamboo. And then later on, the church would be improved to be constructed, made out of more sturdy materials. You will see that later on as Professor Ricky Jose will share with us many, many pictures of the different churches in the Cagayan area and other parts where the Dominicans had conducted their missionary activities. So, and then around the church would be constructed the town. Following the laws of the Indies, there would be an open space. The church is one of the main feature in that open space. And then you would have the convento, and then usually a school, and then the houses of the most important people of what would become a town. And around that town, or what is called the mother church or the mother town, would be the visitas, no, the outlying villages that would still be attached to that town, and that would still be that would be administered and visited by the missionary based on that specific town. Inevitably, the missionary, according to the Dominican sources, the missionary would also introduce medicine, Western medicine and pharmacy to the people, because ministering the sick is part and parcel of Christianity. So no one, the missionary does not refuse. In fact, the Jesuits had established a hospital in Antipolo in 1602, and then the Dominicans also established an enfermeria, or a small hospital, in Lalo. So these are part of the things that would be introduced to the natives. And it is inevitable if it is an encomienda and it is a lay person, a Spanish individual, who would be the encomendero. Customs and traditions that would be Spanish customs and traditions would be inevitably introduced, especially for the special days of Christmas. You would have Easter, and then of course All Souls Day, and so on, and the rest of them. Okay, next slide, please. Now, having discussed how education had happened, then you can see that the skull culture that I'm talking about would include not only this material, the material objects, but also the ideas, the concepts, the rites, the rituals, a mindset, a way of thinking that would be introduced together with the actual catechism lessons themselves. For this study, I consulted many sources, but these are the two major sources that I consulted to determine where the two religious orders that I am covering, the Dominicans and the Jesuits, had actually established parish schools or mission schools, no, village schools, and then eventually later on, there would be simultaneous developments in other parts, no, which I shall explain later on. So this is Misioneros Dominicos en el Extremo Oriente, the first volume, 1587 to 1835 by Hilario Osho and Eladio Neira. And I had to go page by page individually and note them down and create a table in order to find out exactly, or to have a good idea of how education through evangelization and eventually formal education through the establishment of schools would take place in the areas under the Dominicans. And then for the Jesuits, it would be the classic work of Father Horacio de la Costa, the Jesuits in the Philippines, 1581 to 1768. Next slide, please. So for the first table, you would have the colleges founded by the Jesuits from 1581 to 1768. 1768 was the year they were expelled, and so that ended the first, the period when the first period that the Jesuits were in the Philippines. And so for this data, 1581 to 1680, you can see that they have established 15 colleges. Now, when we talk about colleges, please do not think of colleges in the modern sense, because colleges today are not the colleges that are referred to in the 16th century. In fact, the term college can mean, or colegio can mean several things. It can mean colegio, which is the actual school itself, like Colegio de San Ignacio or Colegio de Santo Tomas. But it can also mean a dormitory, no? A seminary, where a place where young men would be training to become priests. But it also can mean a residential college or a boarding house, which is also referred to as a colegio. So colleges founded by the Jesuits would be from 1581 to 1680, around 15. No? This would be in all the areas where they would be involved in. Primarily Antipolo, you would also have Taytay, you would also have, of course, in Manila, no, you would have one church in Santa Cruz, and the other, eventually the other Arabales. But in the Visayas, they specifically went to Arevalo. They were invited to go to Arevalo, but later on, Samar and Leyte was specifically asked by the superior. So Samar and Leyte, which later on expanded to cover Bohol, no? And then from there, they also went to Mindanao, specifically Zamboanga and then Basilan. But eventually, these missions would be withdrawn after 1663 when Ternate was abandoned by Spain because of the Dutch, for many reasons, amongst one of them being the Dutch attacks. No? And then from 1681 to 1768, there is only one colegio, and this is specifically the Colegio de Zamboanga. No? Colegio de Zamboanga, for a total of 16. Please do not be misled by the small number, because as I pointed out in the lower portion, this number does not include the many other mission schools which are not counted, no? Not very clearly also, not all of them are specifically identified, but there are many of them, village schools, mission schools. And this also did not include the education obtained by people outside of the classrooms, because there are many of them who were not educated in the classroom, educated personally by the missionary, educated in the convento, educated in houses, no? And then this includes the training of native catechists or the native teachers who would help the missionaries. This is very important. The role that these people played would be really important, no? As we shall see later on. And then, of course, there are also lay-operated schools, no? Because the encomenderos also established schools in their own encomiendas. And so there are village schools that are operated by Spaniards, but included natives as well. And they invited missionaries to visit them. And so this number would be larger than the 16 that would be in the table. Next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide, please.
Whoops.
Something happened. Si Alec. This would be, yes, that blue one, dark blue. Yes, that's the next one. Okay, thank you very much. So this next table would refer to the pioneering Dominican missionaries, no? I decided to separate the pioneering the missionaries from the actual educators, because the source, Misioneros Dominicos en el Extremo Oriente, mentioned pioneering Dominican missionaries and specified who are those that had direct connection with schools themselves. No? But I included the missionaries because, as I told you, evangelization included the process of education itself. And so here in this slide, you can see that Pangasinan had, or rather Cagayan had the largest number of missionaries at an early period, and then followed by Pangasinan. And of course, you would have Manila. And then you would have the others. Now, Tarlac and Nueva Vizcaya, my sense here, and I hope I'm right, no, is that Tarlac and Nueva Vizcaya would be formed little later. So the boundaries of these provinces are not the present boundaries that we know them to be. And so it doesn't mean that because it says here Tarlac is 0, that there was actually none, no? Because at that time, Tarlac was not yet in existence, no? Okay. So Bataan, from the beginning, Bataan was already one of the first 3 areas that would be concentrated on by the Dominicans, no? So Bataan only had 13, but you can see that it would have an important role to play, especially in the area of printing. No? Next slide, please. So the total would be 176. And then for this.
Excuse me, Ma'am Eloisa, that's the alarm. You have 5 minutes left.
Okay. So you have the Dominican educators, 1587 to 1765. You would have 147. This does not include teachers of Latin and humanities, etc., and it also exclude others. Okay, let me go straight now to the results. So implications. Next slide, please. So my assessment is that there is simultaneous development in all educational levels. For example, when I say all educational levels, I mean that there were eventually primary schools were developed, primarily in Manila itself, no? So you would have the Colegio de Manila of the Jesuits. Eventually, you would also have a residential college, but they would also have students that would take a primary, that would be given primary education. This would be the Colegio de San Jose. Then you would have the Colegio de Santo Tomas in 1611 and the Colegio de San Juan de Letran 1620. Now you have then this would be in Manila, but in the provinces, in the areas where the Dominicans and the Jesuits would be involved, you would have the village schools, you would have the parish schools, you have all of them, and there would be no uniform standards on quality, which would give us both positive and negative effects. Negative because there are no uniform standards, and so if the missionary is lax, then he would think that the lesson is enough when in fact, and that students are already learned when in fact it is not enough. But on the positive side, this is also, there's also something good, because even if the missionary was the sole judge of the student performance, you can also see that the outstanding students who are really, really good are given extra attention and they are given more lessons in order to advance much further than the ordinary students. No? So you would have the cases of Tomas Pinpin, who became very, very fluent in Spanish, and became the printer of the first books under the Dominican press, and he himself also authored his own book in Spanish and in Tagalog, librong pinag-aaralan ng mga Tagalog ng wikang Kastila, no? So this means that he was given very special training in order to learn very fluently and to write a grammar book to be followed by Tagalogs. And of course, the special case of Martin Sancho, who is a 10-year-old Pampango boy who in 1587 was brought by Father Alonso Sanchez to Madrid, to Spain. And it is said that the king himself, Philip II, asked him about catechism, and he responded very, very well in Spanish. So he stayed for more than 16 years as a Jesuit. He became actually one of the first Jesuits, Filipino Jesuits, and then came back to the Philippines in 1601 but as a young man, but unfortunately died because of tuberculosis. And then by this time, it is very clear that natives were already training fellow natives. So there were many natives now who would be bilingual, no? But of course, it really depends on the location of the place. because the more isolated the place is, naturally there would be less people who would benefit from this education. Next slide, please. I only have 2 more slides. So implications. So it seems that, as I pointed out, the natives therefore acquired a very early school culture during the 16th century. Not only did they learn about Christianity, but they also learned about many ideas, many concepts that would have a long-term influence in the development of the Philippines. For example, they learned to follow a daily schedule from sunrise to sunset, which would mean that they became used to following a regime, a daily regime, which became very important because this helped them to adjust and go on, especially the talented ones, to go on to Manila. They were sent to Manila and given, some of them are given scholarships, becas. So they observed rules and regulations in the schools, in the dormitories. So it became, a structured life. And the conversion fostered religious unity, Catholicism, Christianity created a kind of unity that is important, that is really basic, but it also it became a stepping stone to encourage political cohesion and integration, which I think Dr. Dumol was pointing out in his lecture on the foundation of the Pueblos. And then this opened opportunities to educated persons. It's very clear to the natives that the educated persons had other careers. They became catechists. Some of them became teachers. Others became managers of boarding schools. Others became interpreters. Others became clerks. Some of them even became notaries, according to Father Schumacher. So this opportunities is not lost on many natives. So they became and were recognized as non-traditional leaders. So outside of the datus or the traditional leaders in the barangays or the settlements, you would see that they were recognized now as non-traditional leaders. Last slide, please. So the rise of a school culture nurtured the belief in the high value of education. And this, I think, is very important, which also made the first native converts the first to send their children to become educated. And so it should not surprise us to find out that the Tagalog regions and Pampanga were also the first to send their children to the schools in Manila, because they were also the first ones to be converted. If we follow the direction or the development of conversion. So by 1698, the first native secular clergy was produced, and over time, meaning decades, 100 years, more than 100 years, by 1700, a common faith, common laws, a common territory, which is Filipinas, a common government, contributed to a common consciousness of ethnicity, meaning Filipinos belonging to a country. And the last one, please. So this imagined community, to quote Ben Anderson, would bear fruit led by the best educated, which are the Ilustrados in the 19th century, who changed the course of Philippine history, but whose beginnings lie in the seeds of a school culture sown in early Spanish Philippines. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. De Castro. Virtual applause for Dr. De Castro for an enlightening and engaging discussion of the beginnings of school culture in the Philippines. Engaging because so far the presentation has elicited about 3 or 4 questions already. But let us save those questions for later. We will have the Q&A after we listen to all the presentations. Okay, so thank you, Dr. De Castro.
You're welcome, Noy.
Okay, so for our second speaker, studied anthropology and Philippine studies, art history at the University of the Philippines. His research, writings, and advocacy focus on church cultural heritage of the Hispanic Philippines. Presently, he is the archivist of the University of Santo Tomas in Manila. He also teaches at the UST's Cultural Heritage Studies program. His latest book, which came out early this year, is Simbahan, an illustrated guide to 50 years of the Philippines must-visit Catholic churches. So, ladies and gentlemen, let us all welcome, again with our virtual applause, Professor Regalado Trota Jose.
Thank you very much. Can you see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. So over the past years, I have been writing monographs about churches. One of my projects has been to identify what are the oldest structures built by the priests and friars who came to our country. So I am presenting my findings for the first time. I'm happy to present them here at the Quincentennial and to PNHS. Thank you very much for this opportunity. These are all tentative conclusions, but I'd like to present them so that we can further follow up this list. So I will begin conduct my presentation geographically, first through Manila, and then Cagayan and Pangasinan. So for the sources for Manila, the oldest document that we have is a copy of a map of 1602, but the copy was made later in the 17th century, in 1886 and 1883. But it's the oldest one that we have, where there's a sketch of a chapel or a church in Baybay, Binondo, which is now San Nicolas. And the reason that this map, that this church figures here is because Baybay was a subject of a controversy between the Augustinians and the Dominicans. So eventually, in 1613, this church was demolished. Okay. But you can see here, if the sketch is true, then it was made of cut stone by 1602, and it had a tile roof. So the next document is this famous Museo Bello chest, and the underside of the chest has a painting. And there have been various datings of this chest. Some dated to as early as 1583, but that is not possible because the walls were constructed in the 1590s. And so, basing on that, it's at first glance it's so hard to analyze this the painting. But you can see that there are two churches here, two towers, and identify them as the Monastery of Santa Clara, established in 1621, and the Chapel of the Incarnation, which was founded in 1636. Therefore, I would think that this lid is at the earliest 1636. Now, on the lower corner, you will see that there is a Church of Santo Domingo here, and there is actually a Dominican here, and then the Parian, and there's a church tower here, and Binondo, there's also a church tower here with a cross, and the Hospital de San Gabriel, which was established first in the Parian, but in 1598, it was moved over to the Binondo side, and Longos. Okay, just a few notes. The San Gabriel site, which was first here in the Parian, that is where the Doctrina Christiana was first printed. But then it moved to Binondo after that, 5 years after that. Now, although I said that the lid would date to 1636, the structure of Baybay is still complete. It was supposed to have been destroyed in 1614. So I think that for the Chinese artists who painted this, it might have been more symbolic than real. Anyway, that is guesswork. None of these churches have survived, so maybe we can do archaeological excavations. So here are the details of the churches. So you can see here the Dominican. You can even see that there's Santo Domingo written over here. And this is the Parian. And I would guess that there is a departure here, no? Considering that there was the Chinese insurrection in 1639, and then that they were forced to move out in 1642 from the Parian. I suspect, I would suggest that this departure is the depiction of the Chinese leaving the Parian to move into the Binondo area. And this is the Church of Bye-Bye. And you can see here it's even written here Longos. Longos was the earlier name, and when they built the church, it was renamed Bye-Bye. And the Hospital de San Gabriel and the Church of Binondo. So here is a rare pen and ink of Binondo as it appeared in 1645. This also is in the Augustinian archives in Valladolid. And why does it appear, this Dominican church, in an Augustinian archive? Because also there was a conflict in territory between Binondo and Tondo. So here is a church of Tondo and Binondo. You know that it was also spelled as Minondo. You can see here that this is a large stone church by 1645, and it's the document is dated February 14, 1645, and just a few months later, in November, the whole thing would tumble in the Great Earthquake of 1645. So this is a rare document of Manila. Actually, you can present another conference just about this map and what it represents, because the people who owned houses are identified here by name. Okay, now we go to UST. The oldest plan of UST is dated about 1680, prepared by Father Juan Peguero, whose signature is here. And so this is a plan of Intramuro of Santo Tomas. And here is the main gate, which is this one. And we also have the documentation of the donation or the purchase of that land from Juliano Gutierrez, who sold it to the Dominicans as early as 1605, even before the establishment of UST. So the Dominicans were already buying houses as a source of income for their activities. So this document is also filed in our archives. This is the main entrance, which has been transferred to the UST San Paulo campus. Okay. And of course, we know that the whole structure was bombed, and even this beautiful stairway. And after the war, they just picked up the pieces and put them in the UST Museum. So the only remnants we have of this fantastic stone stairway are this punggok na, little stubs of granite in the UST Museum. Now let's go over to the Cagayan Valley, where I found the most number of old churches. The sources for my study here are essentially the histories of Julian Malumbres, who wrote on Historia de Cagayan and Historia de Isabela, and also the Dominican acts of the chapters. Every 2 years they would meet and they would nominate the next parish priests for all the missions, and also they would accept or close the missions that were operating. So this is a valuable guide. I just have to go to each act to find out which were the missions accepted and who were the persons who were assigned to these places. For example, in Camalaniugan in 1614, Camalaniugan at the time was the host for the priests assigned to Apari, Bugay, Tocolan, Agataran, and Nasiting, and headed by Father Francisco de Cabrera with his assistants. So the acts of the Dominicans are a valuable aid for establishing continuity of these missions or the establishment of these missions. And having known who were these people assigned, you can look therefore the biographies in the book of Father Othio and Father Nera, whom Dr. De Castro mentioned a while earlier. For example, Gabriel Serrano is mentioned here as having built the Tower of Tuao, the facade of Bugay, and the Acts of Cabagan, which is now San Pablo. So these biographies are good links to the acts of the Dominicans. So you have to put them together. this is what I've been doing for many of the churches to find out when did they actually exist and who were the priests assigned there as well as their assistants, and also the sources for these priests as proof that the people did indeed exist. So these are the priests assigned in Potol, which is now Putol in Apayao. And many of my findings have been published in a series in Philippine Sacra. The whole series is now available online, so there's no problem about accessing these articles. So there is a map in the Archive General of the Indias, dated about 1719, which shows the Cagayan River and the various churches along the way. It was made because they had an insurrection of the Taoist people, the Tugod people, and so they built a fortification there. I do not know if this buildings still exist. In any case, the documentation is not very dependable because the churches look generic. So, but at least they show that they suggest that by this time the churches are already substantial. Now let's go to what I would think is the earliest structure in Cagayan, as far as churches are concerned. The tower, not the church, but the tower of Nasiping, which is now a barrio of Gatare. Actually, it's a very sleepy town, sleepy barrio. But you can see here the basis for the age. The bell tower is quadrangular. It is here's the bell tower. It is built on a lower slope than the rest of the church. And the bell tower is built of rough stone. The first two stories are built of rough stone. And then the third story, which may have been an addition, is of brick. So you can see the change in technology. And also the round buttresses at the corners of the tower are also in brick. So I deduced that the stone was earlier and then the bricks arrived later. And then you see a large ruin of the convento. Nasiping was one of those few which were allowed 6 cells in the entire Cagayan Valley. The other was in Pata in Sanchez Mira. So they were allowed 6 cells in the 17th century. So, and after that, they were not allowed that anymore. So this must have been built in the 17th century. And this is an interesting curved bench of brick, which I presume might have been done by Gabriel Serrano, who was assigned in the area. Then we go to Pata, which is now a sleepier barrio in Namuac in Sanchez Mira. It's very hard to discern the structures, but you can still see the facade, part of the facade, and the convento. It also housed at least 7 missionaries in between 1614 and 1706. Therefore, this structure was also by the 17th century, and it disappeared by 1757. But by this time, there was no permanent priest anymore in Pata. Then we go to Bugay. According to my list, this could have been built between 1653 and 1640. You can see at the back of the church, it's all rubber work, and then the facade later is of brick. So this is the earlier structure. And Father Serrano must have put in the brick facade, as Father Osio mentioned, in his assignment there in the late 17th century, in the early 18th century. Then, of course, the famous Lalo. But the facade is new. Facade was put in the 19th century. But here you can see its importance as the seat of as the capital of the province. The tower can be plainly seen from the Cagayan River. They recently conducted a restoration of the church and then covered the old bricks here. So I would suggest that here the earlier structures are also of stone, but later encased in brick. That has to be proven. But by the proportions, they are very early from the 17th century, including this chapel here and the huge buttresses. This is Malaweg in Cagayan, which is now called Rizal, but I prefer to call it Malaweg to distinguish it from the other towns called Rizal in the country. And you can see also by the proportions that it is early structure. And we know that it was built in the early 17th century, and there was a collapse after an earthquake, and then they rebuilt it, but in a smaller scale. So you can see here the outer apse built of rough stone, which was built between 1617 and 1641, and then the newer apse inside the church built between 1641 and 1651. And there is a monument for the cross and the blue and white pottery, which have been dated to the late 16th and early 17th century. So that confirms the construction of this area. And again, the quadrangular bell tower. The apse was made smaller, perhaps because of there's a reduction in population, which we'll see also in other places. Then we have Tocolana. There were a number of earthquakes, but I guess that this was built after the earthquake of 1619. Again, rough stone. And then by 1692, it also lost its independence. So this structure definitely dates from the 17th century. Then in Fuga Island, where Dr. Churchill also has been as a newly wedded bride. Okay, so we know that from the assignment of the parish priest, this was built between 1623 and 1683. And the convento here also was allowed to house 4 friars. And we know that this was standing before 1660 because by 1660, the Dominicans started to relocate the people from Fuga to the mainland for easier evangelization. And why did they develop such a large complex? Because Fuga here was a stepping stone at the time to Taiwan and to the Fujianese mission. That's why it was such a large church. And it would be interesting to correlate the ruins of another Dominican church in Chilong in Taiwan, built by the Dominicans, but we do not know how it was done. But they're slowly excavating it now. And we have Tabang, which is now Santo Niño, also now in the Tawas area. This is the first mission of the Dominicans in the Tawas area on the western bank of the Cagayan River. And you can also see here the rubble stone and then the brick additions later. Now we go down south to what is now San Pablo, but formerly known as Cabagan. And we know that the church was built between 1656 and 1661 and damaged by the earthquake of 1688. And when Father Serrano arrived there, Father Serrano was assigned into Tuguegarao, which is the next town. And so we know that he was commuting from San Pablo to Tuguegarao. And he reduced the wide length of the nave to a transept and narrow down the nave. So you can see here, the earlier church is this one, and the later construction is this, the narrow nave. But you can see here the huge boveda, which I suspect is of stone, but when Serrano came, he encased it in brick. The facade comes from the later part of the 18th century, or even the early 19th century. Again, here we see the curved bench, which you saw in Nasiping, which is, I presume, was also done by Gabriel Serrano. Now we go to the churches of Apayao. Amazingly, we find stone churches there, and further, more amazingly, that they are supposed to have been done in 1 year, or little more than a year, both by Pedro Jimenez. This is the church in Puntol, formerly Fotol, which William Henry Scott refers to, and it also has a huge stone vault, and it has preserved its frescoes, very, very important. So you can see again here the wrapped stonework. This is a church in Kapinatan, which is now a barrio of Puntol. And you can see again here the layers of stone, and then where the stone has fallen off, they just included bricks. So the bricks came later. we know the Gataran, which it is a new aspect now because it was bombed in the war. You can see how it looks like after the war. But you can see that the lower structure is of rough stone, and then the refinements are done in brick. And the windows, the top niche here, has a resemblance to what I suspect Gabriel Serrano did for Bugay. And later we will summarize these changes by Serrano. Tuao is also another large Itawes town, but it collapsed in 1749. So nothing remains of this church anymore except some remains here. And the church is completely new, but here again, the quadrangular bell tower is still there. This is Kamalanyugan, which I would date to the early 18th century. And it is now all of brick. And we have the remains of an Orno, the brick kiln, which is huge, one of the biggest along the Cagayan River. So I suspect it would have supplied also the bricks in other parts of the Cagayan province. In Piat Cagayan, there are two churches, the church dedicated to Santo Domingo, which is the earlier one, and then the one dedicated that was built as a chapel for Our Lady of Piat, which is also from the early 1600s. But the church may have been built by Father Francisco Jimenez in 1740. And the convento is also huge. It has the same proportions as that of Malaweg. Now, there was another earthquake, and they had to buttress this convento with huge buttresses. Now, this buttress is interesting because it has the name of the parish priest and the year, 1783. So therefore, the buttress, this must have been existing before that time. Only the back of the church has survived. Now we go to Pangasinan. There are fewer church examples here. This is Bimaloy. Bimaloy. The dates are not very clear, but the tower is earlier than the church because the church is supposed to be the church that was together with the tower was built on this side, which is now a hospital. And when it was rebuilt, it was moved to the western part. So therefore, this is the earliest part of the compound, and it was also quadrangular. And we know that in the 18th century, it was renovated. So I presume that the core of this is the earliest part, and then in the 18th century, it was decorated with brick. So the rest of the church is 18th century and later. We go to Manawag, which we know was built between 1701 and 1722. However, it is very difficult to ascertain what are the earliest parts of this church, but it has been the subject of so many renovations. But you can see that the church has really gone through several renovations because you can see all these buttresses of different sizes and shapes, and they don't match the others on the other side. So in 1892, the tower collapsed. So we have a new tower now in Manao. Then we go to the last church in Pangasinan, San Jacinto. We know that a church of brick was built in 1721 and finished in 1731. But the earthquake also destroyed it, and so we only have this ruin, the nave, which is now a stage, and the tower, which is also quadrangular. So I'd just like to summarize some of the points that I presented. It seems that Father Gabriel Serrano was one of those elusive builder priests, and we can see his work through the brick additions. First, when he was in Bugay, we have this inverted pyramid base for the windows, and it's found also in Gataran. And we know that later on, I'll show you that somebody from Cagayan moved over to Pangasinan, and he may have copied this. So going back to Gabriel Serrano, during his time, he put also this curved bench, which you also find in San Pablo. These are the only curved benches in the place. And he also encased the stone vault of Cabagan with brick and also supported it with buttresses. And these are the windows that I was telling you about. the inverted bases for the windows, which are found in Bugay and Gataran. And we know that there was a lay Dominican, Fray Francisco Ferrer, who was working in Cagayan, in Apari, and then moved to Pangasinan. But he was caught by the Palaris revolt there. And he's said to have rebuilt the churches of Lingayen and San Fabian. And I suspect while he was there in Pangasinan, he also included these motifs in the churches of Bimalay and Dagupan. Dagupan is a later church, but you can see here from a 1960s photograph that you can kind of discern the earlier church here. So that would also date that these windows are also earlier. Now, I've tried to show that rough stonework is an identifying mark for the early churches. But it seems that I'd like to find out if this rough stonework survived into the 19th century, because we have this school, the Minanga School in Apari, which looks very, very old. The stonework is definitely primeval, shall we say, but it has a date 1891 or 1897. I think this is 1891. So my question is if we know that the earlier structures of Apari were built nearer the Cagayan River, and that some of them were washed away. But we know that a ruin of the church was still standing by 1900 and was being rented out by the Dominicans to a Chinese merchant as his bodega. So could this have been part of that complex? And then when they put in the windows, then they just put the date 1891. So I submit this for further forensic studies. And also this similar kind of rubber work can be found on the back of the Church of Claveria. Now Claveria is also, this is definitely a 20th century church, but we know that Claveria was called Kabikungan, which is also one of the oldest towns of Cagayan. The chroniclers say that the old town was across further east, no? But I would like to also put my question, because this, you can see here a larger foundation. And then the SBDs later put a smaller church on the large foundation. And this stonework is behind the church. There are also other stone ruins here. So I would like to have this structure also analyzed forensically, if this dates to the 17th century, or was it the continuation of rubber work in the Cagayan Valley until the technology just disappeared. So putting these items together, I would say that Cagayan, the Cagayan Valley, including Fuga and San Pablo, has the greatest percentage of tentatively datable 17th century and early 18th century structures in the entire country. There are none in Bataan. Bataan was devastated by the Dutch in the 17th century. And there are fewer in Pangasinan, which has also changed a lot. But in Cagayan, thanks in part to its inaccessibility to most of us, it has preserved most of its early churches. And I would like to encourage the participants also to, now that we know this, I hope that we give them respect and that we clear them up, but let us not make them over with lipstick and with hype. The oldest. That's going to not be very good for us. These are monuments to the peoples working together with the friars for their own education as well, the catechism. So I end there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Jose. Virtual applause for Professor Jose. Okay, for a jaw-dropping presentation. I'm still in awe with those old maps and photographs of those ruins or whatever remained of those churches. It is like an invitation to go to Cagayan and other northern provinces. So hopefully this pandemic would end soon so we can roam around once again. So thank you, sir, Sir Ricky. Our next speaker is an assistant professor of history at the University of Asia and the Pacific, where she teaches classes in Philippine history and Rizal. She holds a PhD in history from the University of the Philippines, Diliman. Her dissertation focused on the rise and development of pueblos in Laguna from the late 16th to the mid-18th century. Her current research interests include women's property and indigenous land ownership. Let us all welcome once again with our virtual applause, Dr. Grace Lisa Concepcion.
Maraming salamat, Professor Noy. Magandang umaga po sa inyong lahat para sa mga nasa Pilipinas. For those who are in another hemisphere, good evening, good afternoon, Dr. Churchill. Good evening na po, no? First, allow me to thank the NHCP, the Philippine National Historical Society, and Dr. Churchill, and the conveners of this conference for inviting me to participate in this very historic encounter, the Philippine International Quincentennial Conference. It's really an honor to be with all of you today, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to share with you my work. Caveat muna po bago ako mag-share ng slides. Ito ay isang ongoing project. Ongoing siya since 2019, tapos nagka-pandemic. So medyo na-stall, no? Hindi ko na ituloy ng tuloy-tuloy dahil sa pandemya. So sa makatuwid, ang ibabahagi ko sa inyo ay simula pa lamang. Hindi katulad nung kay Sir Jose na tapos na. May conclusion na siya. Ako walang conclusion. Kaunti lang. But I hope that this can motivate all of us here, the participants here in Zoom and in Facebook, to also do some reading and explore this early part of our history. Okay, so you allow me, I will now share my screen with you. Nakikita po ba? Magpe-present na ako. So it means I will not be seeing you. Yeah, ayun. Okay. Ayan. Okay, so ito po yung pamagat ng aking presentasyon. Indigenous landowners in the Philippines, late 16th and 17th century. So the aims of the presentation are very basic: to share my ongoing research on land ownership and to examine land ownership by natives using notarial records of land sales and claims in the Philippines in the 16th and 17th centuries. And then present some ideas of land use and ownership that the indigenous people practiced. So before we proceed, just a word on the sources used. So notarial records para po sa mga nagre-research dito at siguro mga mag-aaral, ano ba itong notarial records, no? So basic dictionary definition is this: it's a register usually kept in a bound volume that lists the date, time, and type of each official act. Diba tayo nagpapanotarize tayo ng mga dokumento tapos nililista yon sa isang registry. Ganun din ang ginagawa ng mga Espanyol noong panahon na yon. It's also a document drafted or paraphrased by a civil notary, filed into public record, and housed in a notarial archive. Okay. So I was able to consult some of them. The specific documents I consulted for this project are used to be found in the Augustinian archive in Manila until 1764. But why the Augustinians and why 1764? So these records include the procedure by which natives proved the ownership of lands they were selling and their reasons for the sale. No? Tapos itong mga these lands ended up later comprising the Augustinian estate, no? Yung pinakamalaking friar land. So I suppose friar land would be more familiar to many of us today. Okay. In the absence of land titles, witnesses, other natives from the same town or neighboring areas were invited to provide their testimony about the owner of the land and how it was used. So may interview na nangyayari. Later, I will explain to you the procedure that I saw after reading this notarial records. So now these documents are compiled in Lilly Library in Indiana University. Kasi yung mga in 1764, so the British came and it seems that they got documents from the Augustinian archive here, tapos napunta sa Britain, and then later on auctioned, and then later on it ended up in the collection of a university in the US. So marami pong dokumento, I think ganun ang nangyayari, no? And yeah. So note, the documents are in Spanish and I haven't found Tagalog copies of these documents. So far, ang nakita ko pa lang, mga documents with signatures in baybayin, but there, at least in this volume, there were no Tagalog translations. Okay. So a bit of a background before proceeding. When Dr. Noy mentioned earlier that I researched on the Laguna Pueblos for my dissertation a few years back, and I saw some documents on cases of land dispute among natives. So it was the indigenous Tagalogs quarreling on or arguing about who was supposed to own a parcel of the land. No? So I got interested and I said, sila rin pala nag-aaway-away tungkol sa lupa, tapos well-documented, no? Mediated, of course, by Spanish officials and even friars, no? So the Spaniards, ang lumalabas doon, yung Spaniards yung parang nagiging intermediaries between the two conflicting parties. Okay, so I got interested in that, and so I did some further research and landed with this Augustinian cases or cases of lands that later on pertained to the Augustinians. Okay, sorry, naglagay ng picture. So in 2019, I was able to go to Lilly Library. This was like the last travel before the pandemic, and I was able to consult some of those documents I found cited in the work of Nicholas Kushner. I suppose many of you will be familiar with his work, Landed Estates in the Colonial Philippines. So when I browsed his bibliography and his work cited, I found documents on Augustinian lands. Tapos sabi niya, Lilly Library. So I just Googled, saan ba tong Lilly Library? So, and so I managed to promotion, no? Lilly Library kasi grants scholarships to researchers, and I really encourage the researchers here to apply for those grants because they're quite generous, and then you just submit a proposal on your research for as long as you can. Tell them, you show that you are going to peruse documents in their library. They will give you support. So ayan. Anyway, okay, so tama na yung introduction. We'll proceed to do the topic. So this is the area in question, Manila, south of Manila, sa may bandang Alabang, Muntinlupa, Las Piñas, no? And this is the region. Kahapon ang discussion natin Visayas, ngayon Tagalog naman, no? Okay, so let me read first before I go to the related literature. The Spanish presence in the Philippines since 1565 catalyzed changes in land tenure practices through land grants bequeathed by the Spanish government to conquistadors and religious orders. So parcels of what seemed to be unused land, particularly in provinces surrounding Manila, the capital, were considered the crown's and were given as a grant, either as a reward for the conquest or in support of missionary work. However, many of these lands served as hunting or farming ground for the native Tagalogs of Luzon, the biggest island in the Philippines, where, of course, Manila, the capital of the Spanish Empire, was located. So in her study of the Audiencia of Quito in Ecuador, historian Tamar Herzog saw that the Spanish government was prepared to recognize the right of native groups to their lands. But undeniably, their presence gave rise to factors that slowly alienated these indigenous people from their lands. So ganun din po ang nangyari sa Pilipinas. Although the Spanish government made provisions to ensure that these lands were not owned by anybody before they were given as grants, the process was not foolproof. Native leaders came forward to contest the ruling on these grants. Notarial records of the Real Audiencia of Manila attest to the complexity of the issue, which was related to overlapping ideas of land tenure and other dynamics that were altered thanks to the laws that were introduced. So I will tell you about the process of probing the rightful owners of the lands that were the object of these transactions. Records of this process are interesting because they show the concerns of those indigenous Tagalog, how they treated land, how they used it, and why they disposed of it. In a way, these transactions, fueled by colonial systems, open a window to notions of land ownership and the factors that led to changes in land tenure in Spanish Philippines. But now it's not my aim to distinguish which one is distinctly native and distinctly Spanish. My aim now is to understand what constituted ownership and also look into the process by which this was proven and see who the land, examine the identity of these indigenous landowners. Now, para rin makilala natin sila. Okay, so some literature review. In his seminal work, Hispanization of the Philippines, historian John Ledy Phelan wrote in 1959 that the Spaniards made sweeping changes to land tenure practices in the Philippines by introducing private ownership. This claim buttressed succeeding claims about the wholesale transformation of land owning practices in the Spanish era. Almost 50 years later, historian Glenn May scrutinized Phelan's claim by arguing that very little data supported it. At present, historians tend to examine indigenous land ownership, not only drawing on extant records, but looking at them using the lens of anthropology and linguistics. Anthropologist Fernando Cialcita claims that natives of the Philippines in the Tagalog region, the area under study in this paper, exhibited forms of individual ownership of land based primarily on their mode of subsistence, which consisted of wet rice farming. Wet rice farming involved intensive use of the land. Therefore, it made sense to demarcate the farming area and not leave it to be used by anyone else. Swidden farming, on the other hand, did not require intensive use of the land. After using a plot, Swedeners left the ground lying fallow for long periods and thus left it as a common property. But none of the works I just mentioned looked at individual cases of native-owned lands. So far, I've only seen Sir Ricky Jose's works on extant primary sources in UST. Sir Ricky, promoting your work here. He documented land ownership of natives in Manila and Bataan. And these were published only in 2020 and 2021. So if you want to consult it, you may, because these works are online. So we can ask, how did pre-Hispanic Tagalogs use farming and Swidden lands? We have here an observation of Fray Juan de Plasencia, who was a missionary in the Laguna area. He wrote at the end of the 16th century, he documented the land-owning practice of the Tagalogs of the Central Luzon region of the Philippines. This group engaged both in wet rice and Swidden farming. The lands where they resided, he said, they divided among the entire barangay. Thus, each person in each barangay knew his own lands, especially those with irrigation. No one from another barangay worked on them other than after purchase or inheritance. In the tinges or uplands, they did not have them divided, except by barangay. Being therefore of that barangay, even though he might have come from another village, any person, once he had harvested rice, who has started to plant rice on a piece of land, sows it, and no one can take it away from him. So my paper hopes to contribute to understanding native land ownership by using two cases from the 16th and 17th century. So ito po yung two cases, 1591, Francisco Manilit's claim on a land granted to Luis Davalos, and then 1665 land sale by Maria Banay and family. These lands, as I said, later made up the Augustinian haciendas. I chose the Manilit case because this was the earliest I found, and then Maria Banay's illustrates ownership by women. Nicholas Kushner's pioneering work, Landed Estates in the Colonial Philippines, was the first to study the origins of estates owned by religious orders. I could be wrong, but this is what I found. He hinted at the clash between indigenous and Spanish ideas of ownership, but left the question hanging. Unfortunately, not much work has been produced to update Kushner's research, due mainly to the scarcity of material from the 17th century available in the Philippines, among other reasons. In his 1973, I think there is now surfacing more materials available in the UST archive. In his 1973 article, May Sapan, The Formation and Social Effects of a Landed Estate in the Philippines, Kushner discussed the history of the Augustinian estate. So we can now ask, how did the Augustinians acquire land? So When the Spaniards arrived in Manila in 1571, the crown issued land grants to the first conquistadores as a reward for their work and to the religious institutions in support of missionary work. The typical grants were the peonia, a small estate given to ordinary soldiers, the caballeria, a larger estate given to officers. I don't know what the grant to religious orders was called. One particular case was the Augustinian land. This was made up of an initial grant made to the Augustinians by Miguel Lopez de Legazpi in 1571. It gradually grew thanks to the subsequent donations or purchases of contiguous lands. The documentation available for these lands are not titles but notarial records that show how the land passed from the native owners to the religious order. They elucidate the process that the Spanish government followed when selling land or issuing a land grant. So, just briefly, the Spanish law on land. By Spanish law, lands that were not occupied or tilled were not owned by anybody and could therefore be granted. The Siete Partidas of King Alfonso el Sabio declared that all land belonged to the crown, and to show ownership of the land, one had to occupy and use it. The type of land use recognized by Spanish law was agricultural. Hunting was not really covered by the law. When the Spaniards arrived in the Philippines, their idea of land use and ownership came into contact with indigenous ideas, which combined both intensive agriculture, like wet rice planting, with swidden farming and hunting in the highlands. Many lands, therefore, looked vacant but actually served as hunting grounds for the native settlements. Distribution of land to the colonists and religious institutions gave rise to disputes. Although the Spanish crown tried to establish a process whereby the natives' lands would be untouched by the grants, the Spaniards and religious institutions who received grants attempted to enlarge what was originally given to them. Spanish law followed a procedure on land disposal either by grant or sale. So before land could be granted, it had to be announced to the nearby barangay to give a chance to people to come forward to express their concerns about the grant or the impending grant, whether they were in favor of it or against it. Before natives could sell land, the seller should seek permission from the government and give their reason for selling, whether poverty, inability to till, etc. Before permission could be granted, the sellers had to prove that the land was theirs. In the absence of titles, sellers were required to present witnesses to attest to their long-time possession of the land. So here's the procedure in a diagram. Okay, so the Tagalogs, at least I'm referring to Tagalogs because these are the only documents I've found so far. But I suppose if there were land sales in other areas, they would have followed possibly the same procedure. The Tagalogs who wanted to sell land sought authorization from the Real Audiencia to sell their land for a specific amount. So they issued a diligencia. No, a diligencia was issued, like a process was initiated. To obtain authorization, they needed to prove that the land was theirs. Aside from maps and other documents, they brought in witnesses to attest to their claim to the land. The examination was done by the Teniente de Escribano de Gobierno, and after this, an assessor issued his opinion. Okay. For 4 consecutive Sundays, a pregon or announcement was made that the land was being sold by the sellers concerned. Para siyang, I think, wedding banns, no? Di ba? Consecutive Sundays, announce kung sino ikakasal. So I guess, ganun din sa land. This was to give a chance to anybody who had objections to come forward. Once the ownership was established and no one contested it, the government authorized the sale. And then the sale took place. The buyers asked the government to grant them possession of the land. Then a ceremony of possession took place in the presence of the buyer, the seller, witnesses, officials of the Real Audiencia, the Alcalde Mayor, and the interpreters. The natives were made to understand that the possession transferred the ownership of the land. Okay, so this is the case of Manilit and Saingan versus Luis Davalos. This is just a summary of the case. So it started in 1584. Luis Davalos was going to be given a grant by the Spanish Governor General. And where was this? It was somewhere in Santa Ana de Sapa. He was going to use it to pasture, as pasture for his cattle, and also rice and corn plantation. So before the land could be granted, the Alcalde Mayor convened the principales, Christian and non-Christian elite to announce the possible grant. Okay. So there was a probanza or an interview of the principales, and they gave a go signal. No, they said, well, this called my attention because I think a couple of them said that the presence of a Spaniard there in that area would provide protection against Zambales. I'm not sure if Sir Ricky Jose remembers, but I emailed him. I asked him, Sir, nakakarating ba yung mga taga Zambales sa Manila? Kasi bakit Zambales ang tawag, no? Or maybe it was just a generic name for people from the Tingis or the more mountainous or hilly parts, no? So anyway, the principales said the land grant would not harm anybody. So that was 1585. So fast forward, in 1591, Francisco Manilit and Francisca Saingan contested the grant. These two were siblings, no? Francisco and Francisca. So they then presented their position. So like a case was opened and they had to present their position. Kung si Manilit, bakit niya kiniklaim? Si Davalos, ano yung ginawa niya? Like he even said, hindi pwede kasi I already invested a lot on this property, no? May mga ginawa na raw siyang infrastructure, etc., etc. But Manilit was insistent, and he said that we had been there since time immemorial, so it's ours, no? Anyway, but what happened was after the probe, Manilit and Saingan opted to settle for an amount, and they were paid 100 pesos in gold for the land in question. Davalos agreed to pay. Okay, so
Ma'am Grace,
yes.
Sorry for interrupting, but you have 3 minutes left.
3 minutes. Okay, fast forward na ako kay Maria Banay. So later, if you have questions, I can elaborate. Kasi meron pa akong sample testimony with the witnesses, kung ano yung mga sinasabi nila. But, so, ito na lang, why didn't Manilit contest the grant in 1584 when it was announced? Kasi parang importante yun. Bakit naghintay siya ng 4 na taon, no? Or 6 years, I think. He didn't understand the announcement, he said. He didn't know the land would be used for cattle. And then he said the cattle in the land prevented him from hunting, and he didn't have money to present the case. So he kept quiet. So this leaves a lot of room for speculation and for imagination also to fill in the gaps on what kind of what lives the Tagalogs then in the 17th century led, how their mode of subsistence was, how they survived, their livelihood, etc. So anyway, this could be for another presentation, but this case is interesting. Maria Banay's lands. I'll just show you the extent of her lands. She featured in the documents from 1636. And up to 1665, she was transacting with the government. So this is a current map of Las Piñas. And from the document that was drawn, the map that was drawn of her land, I just made a little approximation of the possible extent of her land. So medyo malaki ang kanyang lupa. And in fact, later on, she said that because of poverty and because other natives were not respecting her property anymore, and she was old and sick, she could not really guard her property, she was going to sell her land. And for how much? She was paid 600 pesos. Well, at least she set that amount, 600 pesos in gold. So, mas malaki talaga yung property niya kaysa kay Manilit, because Manilit, I guess, settled for 100 pesos. I don't know how they value the land, but that's another question that we can that is open for investigation. So, papakita ko lang yung map na pinapresent. Of course, this is not the type of map that we have. And this is the map depicting Maria Banay's property. Okay. So, sabi ko pa, mineasure ko konti. Wala akong masyadong clue sa GIS, but approximate distance per Google map is 5 kilometers, the extent of her property. So, anyway, the points drawn from the probe, this is just by way of conclusion. Land was passed on from parents to children. Siblings and relatives who belonged to the same barangay were authorized to use the land for hunting and farming. The groups that did not belong to the barangay paid the owners for the use of the land. And antiquity of settlement was recognized as a sign of ownership. And in Maria Banay's case, she said that she didn't have any more slaves to till her land. Of course, I was relying on Spanish translation. And Indigenous women's ownership was recognized. So these are my tentative conclusions. A combination of economic and political factors led to the change of ownership, and the Spanish drive to eradicate slavery in the Philippines might have affected natives' relationship with their land. And lastly, the weakened position of the Datu undermine their hold on much of their land. So thank you very much for your attention. And thank you, Sir Noy, for your prompt.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Grace Concepcion. Virtual applause for Ma'am Grace.
Thank you po.
Okay, another very engaging discussion. How I wish I had the time machine to go back in that era, okay, and bring with me more than 600 pesos, okay, to buy those lands. And I believe that the discussion of Dr. Concepcion puts to rest the claim of a certain Julian Taliano. For those of you who are not familiar with Mr. Taliano, he's claiming that he is the owner of the entire Philippine archipelago. Okay? So hopefully this presentation would help in putting that to rest. Okay? So our last speaker comes from Spain. He is a professor at the University of Alicante. Okay, he has completed the grades in Arab and Islamic Studies, Humanities, Hispanic Studies, and Musicology. A Master in Islamic Studies at the University of the Philippines, and a PhD in Philology. He has edited classical references for Philippine literature and history as the Noli Me Tangere and the Baxter Codex. Okay. It's around 4 a.m. in Spain, so we will be showing now a pre-recorded presentation of Dr. Donoso. Okay, so let us all welcome the presentation of Dr. Donoso.
sa inyo lahat. Ako po si Isaac Donoso dito sa Espanya, sa Universidad ng Alicante. At para sa akin, may isang malaking karangalan itong sali ng itong konferensya tungkol ang Quincentenario sa unang biyahe sa buong mundo ni Fernando Magallanes at kasama ni Juan Sebastián Elcano. Tapos nangyari doon ang encuentro sa Pilipinas at maraming kwentuhan tungkol ito sa magkatapos. At pero sa akin importante itong sa ngayong taon sa 2021 may relasyon pa sa mga Kastila at mga Filipino. Ito importante para sa mga Filipino sa buong mundo. At ibig sabihin demasiado malaki itong planeta. So importante siempre may magandang relasyon. So I am going to speak about this topic, Islamic mission in the Philippines in the early modern era, that will show also this kind of relation before the Prehispanic times, during the Prehispanic times, and how the Spanish intromission in that area of the planet in Southeast Asia changed radically, in the case of the Philippine archipelago, changed radically the natural, human, social, political, and cultural process that was going to take place in the Philippine archipelago if ever these Europeans that cross all over the planet did not arrive to the Pacific, and they didn't cross the Pacific towards Asia. They settled first in Cebu, as you know, in the 1565, and then they found that perhaps was most interestingly to settle in Manila, because it seems to be that Manila was a more important entrepot, commercial port to develop activities and to be the way to jump towards China, that at the end is the profitable market that the European powers were looking for. So I will try to be explaining from a cultural point of view, from different specific cultural trends and cultural elements that we can see in the sources, in the historical sources, about the grade and the development of Islamization of the archipelago. I will focus especially in Luzon, because I think it's something that has not been fully appreciated. And I will, of course, speak also about the southern Philippines, Mindanao and Sulu, but will place a special lens in the Luzon area, Manila Bay. And why we want to do that? Because our intention is to see that the Philippines was being incorporated within the Dar al-Islam, the world of Islam, in the same way that other areas in Southeast Asia were being incorporated, through commerce, through preaching, through mission activities, and through joining the more lucrative, the more profitable market in this area, during the several centuries. Of course, Islamization took place especially in the 13th century in North Sumatra. Islam was known in the area before. From the 8th, 9th, 10th century, we already have Islamic presence in Southeast Asia, but especially the local rulers were adopting Islamic political models in the 13th century. First in North Sumatra with the Sultanate of Samudra Pasai, and there different Islamic kingdoms and then sultanates were emerging in many areas. So what we have in the Philippines was the factual establishment of two sultanates, at least two sultanates in southern Philippines. First in Jolo, perhaps around the 14th century, 15th century, and then in Mindanao. In Mindanao, at the end of the 15th and beginning of the 16th century, we can see when Sarif Kaunsuan arrived to Mindanao, normally the date that was agreed about the arrival of this Kaunsuan from Johore is in the 1515, It means to say, well, we'll speak now in detail about this, but it means to say that is later than Sulu. And then I am saying these two Islamic sultanates in the south, and then in the north, what we have is the evolution, the creation of Islamic kingdoms that were going to, of course, end in a sultanate or different sultanates. This is what the sources tell us about the state of Islamization in Luzon. We have Islamic kingdoms. We have the kingdom of the Rajas, Raja Sulaiman. Obviously, it's an Islamic name, Sulaiman. And we have the kingdom of Lakandula, in Tondo. This seems to be that it's not yet fully Islamized, or is not yet in an advanced stage of Islamization. So it seems to be that was more Manila, this Islamic kingdom that was going to be probably a sultanate in few decades or few time. But well, we have this scenario of Islamic kingdoms in emergence. Well, we are going to discuss, this is the abstract. It's interesting, the sources are saying that the activity, the Islamic activity was really going inside the region, the insular, Southeast Asia, and towards entering already the Pacific region. Well, this is the Strait of Torres, the Strait of Torres that divide New Guinea from Australia. So when the Luis Baez de Torres entered in this strait and discovered this strait and put his name and so on and so forth, in 1606 he encountered in the relation, the account that he made, he wrote, he already explained that there were Muslims preaching to the Papuans, to the New Guineans. Muslims preaching, obviously we have to understand that they are preaching with also the written documents, with the Quran or a section of the Quran or some primers or some Islamic books that they are using for doing this missionary activity in New Guinea. So this is already very far. It's quite going inside already the Pacific region, the oceanic region, going already trespassing Asia. What we can see is that at the beginning of the 17th century, the process is already going further and evolving from centuries already of activity, an activity that of course arrived to the Philippine shores and Philippine ethno-linguistic groups, different tribes in the archipelago were joining this activity. It's famous also the Luzoes, that the Portuguese sources describe the Luzoes that are part of the seamen that are working in Brunei that are working in Malacca. When the Portuguese sources describe Malacca, the people of Malacca, they speak about these Luzoes coming from Luzon, no? And the sources are saying that these Luzoes doesn't have a kingdom, they don't have a king, they are divided in tribes, and that they used to be pagans, no? Pagans, so they are not yet Islamized or fully Islamized in this. At the beginning of the 16th century. So when Magellan arrived to, although he didn't arrive to Manila, but he arrived to the Philippines, the Tagalogs were still not yet adopting fully Islamic practices. No, they were in process, and then when Legazpi arrived, in these cases, so the process after 50 years, the process has been improved, and we can say that in those 50 years, the Tagalogs were adopting more elements. Why? Because of course the missionary process, the presence of Muslim missionaries there, and of course because the Luzoes were participating in this commerce, in this thalassocracy that especially from Brunei were dominating neighboring areas, no? Near Brunei, near Borneo. Well, so we see that a process of Islamization that was denounced by a sector of a conservative sector of the Spanish administration, of the colonial administration when they settled in Manila, especially Melchor de Avalos. We'll see now the documents. Melchor de Avalos was denouncing to the king with 2 letters the Islamic presence in Luzon, or in general in the Philippines, but especially in Luzon. And it's interesting also the famous Boxer Codex that speak directly about the Moros. When the Boxer Codex speaks about Moros, these are the Moros of Luzon. So in the Boxer Codex doesn't appear the Tausug or the Mindanao or whatever tribe in the south, but who are called Moros in the Boxer Codex are the Tagalogs. So in my case, I think that the text referring the Tagalogs in the Boxer Codex is an early text. The description that is made, that appears in the Boxer Codex about Tagalogs, is an early description. I think it's a very early description, about the 70s or 80s as maximum, because the way described Tagalogs is still a way in which Islamic elements are quite evident. No? It's quite evident. So it's a description that, in my opinion, is early in time. It's from the first contact, the first Hispanic contact in Luzon, or during the 70s or early 80s of the 16th century. Well, of course, we have the Brunei, the thalassocracy of Brunei, that was dominating Luzon as well as Sulu. Brunei was really the power dominating those areas, those Philippine areas. And of course, Brunei was not really happy with the intromission of Spain. So they developed several activities. We'll see what activities they developed in order to retain the control of Luzon and Sulu. And so we can pass to the next slides. Then this is the table, what we want to discuss. Well, a little bit Islamization Luzon, of Sulu, Mindanao, of course Luzon. We'll see the sources. These sources are really, I think, the most important in order to see, well, the Islamization across the Boxer Codex. And then the dictionary, the vocabulario of Pedro Samuel Ventura is really very interesting because he's giving many Bruneian words. When he says Bruneian words, no words, palabras bornellas, And so, of course, these are elements that are coming from Brunei and normally are Islamic elements. This is the Bruneian thalassocracy. And then we have different sources and different events that are really landmarks in this process of the Islamization of Luzon. The Islamization, the abortion or stop of that process of Islamization. And this is the Relación del Descubrimiento y Conquista de la Isla de Luzón of the 72. Here is, we'll see now the document. It's really interesting because try to say that the Tagalogs, the people from Luzon, are really not, the southern Luzon, are not really quite Islamic. Then we have, because this Bruneian continuous presence, then we have the Francisco de Sande, by himself, without the authority of the king, he took the decision to make a war against Brunei. And of course, then Melchor de Ábalos, oidor de la Audiencia de Manila, he wrote 2 letters to the king saying that they are Muslims and they had to be slaves because the war is justified, no, against the Muslims, and so the prisoners has to be slaves, no? And in general, what he wants is to enslave all the Muslims, no? But we'll see that this is already was denied by the king, no? Philip II said, no way, no to make slaves. In theory, then in the practice, especially during the conflicted periods, during wars, prisoners of wars were made, and they were afterwards then became slaves. No, this is a fact. Then the Tondo conspiracy. The Tondo conspiracy. That was the end of the process of the Malay and Bruneian presence in Luzon, in Manila. And then afterwards, we have the intromission of Esteban Rodríguez Figueroa as a adelantado de Mindanao. He was supposedly the one who was going to conquer Mindanao, Esteban Rodríguez de Figueroa, and then suddenly, when he arrived to Mindanao, he just went down of the ship, and suddenly there were a conflict there, and he died. Immediately he died. And the process of conquering Mindanao stopped. And so we have that Brunei lost the power of the eastern areas in southern Luzon and in the Sulu archipelago. So from that period, at the end of the 16th century and the beginning of the 17th, Sulu became more independent, and then Mindanao also was not affected. Mindanao was growing in its sultanate. This is a map of the first Islamization of the Philippines. Here I mark the Makhdumun and the Shurafa. These are 2 already names of missionaries, no? The Makhdum is an Arabic name, especially used in India, as a master, usually a master of a tariqa, of a tariqa truk, no? The truk, the mystical cofrades. But can be a missionary, a Sufi, a mystic missionary, or can be simply a trader that is having this title of Makhdum, no? The sources, and Cesar Adil Mahul, he studied the presence of this Makhdumin in the Philippines, and it was really a very interesting and an excellent work in order to highlight the element of these early missionaries in the archipelago, no? The presence of the Makhdumun, because it's not an easy way to really identify these roles, these characters, because the sources, the silsilas sometimes describe, but also is through orality and through also the presence of tombs, inscriptions, epigraphy, that we can really little by little build the who came later, who came afterwards. So I had tried to make here a rationale in order to try to see clearly the process, no, of this Makhdumun, this Shurafa, Sharif, this holy men, no. So in Sulu we have the Tuamasaika, 13th, 14th century, then the Karim al-Makhdum, another one, Raja Baginda from Minangkabau, I think it is, Raja Baginda from Minangkabau, and Raja Baginda finally, well, after also another Makhdum, no, and this Hoi Hoi Assini, that is obviously a Chinese missionary, a Chinese Muslim. So afterwards, this Sharif, this Sayyid Abu Bakr, that became the first Sultan of Sulu, Sharif al-Hashim, no, the first Sultan of Jolo. Well, this a process that Tarsila described, that Salibi already studied and Mahul really detailed, and then Nakib Alatas also studied and tried to clarify a little bit the chronology, no? So this is more or less, as of now, the standard process of missionary activity in Sulu. About Mindanao, well, we have the Sarif Auliya. In his name, there are already two elements, the Sharif and the Wali. The Auliya is the plural. The Wali is also the companion, the Sufi, no? The mystic person, the Wali. Well, we have this, as you can see, is later. Then the Sarif Mahraja and the Sarif Hassan, these brothers that arrived also to Mindanao. And finally, the Sarif Kaumusuan from Johore, that the sources are saying that he took 25 years to conquer Mindanao. So this Sarif Abu Bakr, or Sayyid Abu Bakr, coming from probably from Malacca, no? And the Sarif Kaumusuan from Johore. So are external elements that arrive to the Philippines, and through missionary activity and through especially marrying the princess, they finally created a new dynasty to establish a new state, a new polity based on Islamic law, and this became the Sultan. No, what was a Raja became the Sultan, not only by the power, the military power, but by the will of God, no, by the power that the Sultan has. The Sultan has the Dawla, no? The Sultan has the power of the Dawla, of the state, but in this time, in this 15th century, of course, he has also the religious power, no? The deen. So this was the way that the areas in the Philippines became, no, were adopting Islamic elements at the end. At the end, two sultanates were created, no? The Sultanate. Yeah, we have here. I was saying that we have here, no, the Sultanate of Sulu, incorporating these different areas and different ethno-linguistic groups, the Palawani, the Borbok, Yamapur, and so on forth. Then we have the Sultanate of Maguindanao, that has different regions within the same Sultan, which are the Sibugay, the Tamontaka, and the Buayan, no? Sibugay, Tamontaka, and Buayan. These were three important sections within the Sultanate of Maguindanao. And then what I was saying is that here, perhaps we need a different line, no, coming from Brunei, and this way, going to Manila Bay, southern Luzon, we have the island of Mindoro, Balayan was the name of the region of Batangas, Balayan. Bombon was the region of Taal, and And we know that all the Mindoro was called Mai. Gatmaitan was a name of a family, no? Saying that where appears this Mait was the name of the older Mindoro. In any case, we have a connection from Zaitun, Huangzhou, the Chinese port also were highly Islamized, where plenty of mosques and Muslims were living. And so we have that the Philippines were not in the main route or the main way of the Islamic trade, but the Philippines was really at the end being incorporated within these commercial routes and Islamic ways, Islamic roads. Well, therefore we can find different names of Islamic missionaries. We have the Mahdum, we have the Sharif, the Shaykh. The Shaykh appears, for instance, in the Boxer Codex, appears also in the dictionary of San Buenaventura. The Shaykh appears also. It's a Shaykh, no? The Shaykh. The Hatib, as a Katib, the Hatib is the preacher, the person who made the khutbah, the sermon of the Friday is the Hatib, the one who make the sermon, no? We have the Qadi, which is the justice, the Kali in the Philippines. And then the sources appears also saying, or used to say, about the Moravitos in Spanish, Moravitos de Burabut. This is a person that makes ribat. The ribat is a person that is doing we can say the passive jihad. Is the jihad, the defense of the religion, of the faith, but passively is to say that it's not really inactive, but is in a position preaching and living with an Islamic charisma, but basically it's another Sufi, no? It's another mystic that is living in a small mosque, no? As an ermitaño, basically as an ermitaño. We have also the Gacices. The Spanish sources used to speak about Gacices. The Agathi are the fighters, the warriors during the Futuhat, the campaign, the campaigns of conquering the Futuhat. And then, of course, we have the Sufi. Anyway, we have many concepts and names to describe Islamic missionaries. And then we have, at the end, became in the Philippines the ulama. The al-Faqih was the pandita. The pandita, at the end, is the expert in Islamic law, is the preacher, is the Hatib, the person who made the khutbah, has also the charisma of a Sufi usually. So at the end we have the pandita, of course in Sulu, Mindanao, but once the Islam is already settled and everything is already established, but we have before a long list of missionaries, no? Well, we have here this inscription, famous inscription of Tokmak Balu in Buddahu. Well, this is the first, and after the destruction of the stone, nowadays is there. It's near the city of Jolo. It's really a very interesting place to visit and to preserve, no? And to preserve. And well, it still is not clear who is there, who is this Tokmak Balu. And Atas was saying that probably was Tuan Masaika. But normally the standard story is that is Raja Baginda, no? The person who is here inside the tomb. Well, we have here the translation of the inscription. We made here the trying to transcribe, no? To transcribe what is the contents. This is a tentative transcription. Well, and we can go, because we have very few time more, so we can go directly to speak about what's happened in Luzón. This is the relación del descubrimiento y conquista de la isla de Luzón y Mindoro. Here, this is the title of the account, and it's a very long account saying basically the contents of the account. It's saying that the Moros of Luzón are not like the Moros of Berberia, of Africa, no, Northern Africa, but they are not really quite Islamized. Not even saying that the people that is writing about saying that the people of Luzón are Moros, no tienen razón, no? They are not right. Porque the people from the island of Luzón that usually the Spaniards call Moros, they are not really Muslims. They have some elements, Islamic elements, but they are not really Muslims. Well, this is the title of the account of events, no? And they say that, well, they say basically that some people that has been in Brunei, they understand somehow Islam, are capable to read the Quran, no? Some words in Quran, but they are few. So it's giving an image that there are a divide already in the society of Manila. We have an elite that is Malay, or at least can probably speak Malay, that they are Muslims, and they are coming from Borneo, or at least they intermarry, and they have a very important link with Brunei, with the Sultanate of Brunei. So here we have again the Moro, a Moro Balayan. This is Magat. Magat, the name is Magat. And he's saying that there are preachers coming from different places, here, Patani and Brunei, and they are preaching in these areas, and well, they have the Qurans, and they are preaching the Islam, no, to people from southern Luzon and Mindoro. This was the reason why Governor Francisco de Sande make a ban and a general punishment of preachers, al-faqirs. This is a very important section, because it's saying that they are really an official campaign to eradicate Muslim preachers in Luzon. No? This appears in the letters of Melchor de Avalos, this section, which is, I think, really interesting, because it's saying that Islam was eradicated from Manila and from Luzon. There were a clear campaign against Muslim preachers, and obviously and against Muslim texts, Arabic texts and Qurans, and all the documents that could be circulating in the area. This is the concept that appears in Boxer Codex about the Ambadhala, Namaikapal, and Salahat. Well, about the unique God, no, only one God. Badhala obviously is a Sanskrit name, but we have the concept of Tawhid. The concept of Tawhid, only one God, no? Tawhid, no? The concept of only one God. Well, we have also the Saik. I was saying the Saik. And then the Tagalogs that were dying were going to Makkah. The place of the paradise was called Makkah, no? According to the Boxer Codex. Well, this can be Mecca, no? Clearly. And then the Boxer Codex says that the Tagalogs were using words from Brunei in order to cure some sickness, no? So these are palabras borneias, perhaps words in Arabic, no? And it's interesting because the Boxer Codex is saying that there are other slaves that are known as Tagalogs. So this is why I was saying that the Boxer Codex described an early period, because we have clearly an elite of Muslims, of Moros, and then accordingly we have a different kind of levels of slaves, and some slaves are called the Tagalogs. So this is a puzzling, a difficult way to understand, and unless we understand that the Boxer Codex describes the elite, the Muslim elite, and then the indigenous people were the Tagalogs, and then were part of servants, of slaves, of this Malay Bruneian elite in Manila at the Spanish encounter. No? At the Spanish when the Spanish arrived, what they found in Manila is this elite coming from Brunei. And the Tagalogs, according to the Boxer Codes, were another kind of slaves. Well, this is the document that I try to explain that, of course, in some moment of time, Tagalog was written using Arabic script. We have the Baybayin, of course, used by the Tagalogs. But if we have an elite that is Islamized, that is from Brunei, that can speak also Malay, why we cannot believe or think that it's feasible to think that in some moment of time Tagalog was written using Yahweh script, using Arabic script. So of course we cannot find a document proving that, but through secondary sources, I think that I have encountered the text saying that we have a letter written in Tagalog language with Yahweh script. This is the translation. No, there is una en letra arábiga, one letter in letra arábiga. This Tagalog using Arabic script. Well, this is a text that I already published, so the details of this you can find in the publication. Letra de Meca, Tagalog script, Yahweh script in the Tagalog region in the 16th century. So finally, in order to finish this, we have, of course, the letters of Melchor de Ávalos that was reinforcing the campaigns of Sunday against Brunei, the military campaigns of the 1578, the war against Brunei. Melchor de Ávalos sustained again also the campaign against Muslims in Luzon, and even he said that the Muslims has to be slaves, no, has to be making slaves, which was rejected by the king. No? Well, he wrote here about a general campaign of Muslims. He made this big story in order to convince the king about a Muslim conspiracy, and in fact this took place, but in a very low level, with the Tondo conspiracy of the 87, when of course people from Brunei was trying not to recapture Manila, including people inside already Manila. No, Agustin Lacandula was one of the members of this conspiracy, no? And at the end everybody was so justified, no? Justified, how you say, the Spanish because of this. And so here I have more slides, but I think that we can finish here. We have this that, to conclude at the last part of the 16th century, when the Spaniards arrived to the Philippines and settled in Manila. We have clearly a natural process of incorporating areas of the archipelago within the Dar al-Islam, the Islamic world, through trade, through commerce, through political activities, through the thalassocracy, the maritime power of Brunei, and through missionary activity, particular preachers that arrived to the place, and they were preaching using materials. We have to understand written materials, primers, Islamic devotionaries, Qurans, and different materials that disappear because many reasons, not only the clear destruction of this, but many reasons. But we have a testimony that Francisco de Sande really organized a campaign to eradicate al-Faqirs, ulamas, Muslim preachers in Luzon. No? So at the end, the process of Islamization stopped in Luzon, but follow the natural way in the south, in Sulu and Mindanao. No? And then we have this section that divided the story, but through the historical sources we can see at least some elements of what was taking place in the archipelago during the 16th century in order to Islamize, to Islamize the several ethno-linguistic groups of the Philippines. Well, with this, I want to conclude. I think I extended 5 minutes more. I am sorry. Hopefully you understood more or less what I wanted to say. And thank you really very much. Maraming salamat po sa atensyon sa inyo lahat. At para sa akin talagang malaking karanggahan, a very big honor to be here. And salamat.
Okay, I had to use my headset now because of poor audio in my laptop. So muchas gracias, Dr. Senyor Isaac. Okay, maraming salamat po, Dr. Donoso, para sa isang napakahusay na pagtatalakay ng paglaganap ng Islam, kahit na dumating na yung mga Espanyol, patuloy pa rin ang paglaganap ng Islam sa Sulu at sa Mindanao. Okay? So, virtual applause para kay Senyor Donoso, Dr. Donoso. So thank you to all our speakers for their enlightening presentation. We will now open the floor to questions and comments from our audience. Zoom attendees may use the chat or the Q&A function. But I encourage everyone for those who have questions to please use the Q&A function, because our chat box is already flooded with so many comments, greetings. So please use the Q&A function if you have questions. For our audience on Facebook, you may post your questions in the comment section, and the technical team will collate and forward them to our speakers. Okay, so the floor is now open for your questions. So I will now open the Q&A function. So there are several questions here. So let's begin with the questions for Dr. De Castro. So there are a number of questions here for Dr. De Castro. Let's begin with this one. Citizenship is a rather late and modern category, 19th century. The Indios became not citizens, but subjects of the Spanish monarch, as the other Spaniards were. Would Professor De Castro wish to comment on how this education in subjecthood was actually carried out? Ma'am Eloisa?
Can you hear me? Thank
Yes,
you.
ma'am.
Salamat, Noy. Yeah, I agree with you. It's a rather late development, but I was not using it in that sense. I was actually quoting the work of Dr. Tumol when he said that he translated the 1582 Synod of Manila Manual for Confessors, and he was saying that in the process of resettling the process of resettling the natives in a particular settlement from the dispersed settlements into a specific area, the whole idea is to make them part of the polis, policia, and that's the sense of the citizenship that I meant, not the 19th century. Meaning that you pointed out. No, I didn't mean it that way. To make them a part of the citizens, the settlement, no, to make them feel that they belong to a particular government. No? Now, as for the second part of the question, how were these subjects educated? Well, as I said, it depends on where you are. If you are in Manila, in Intramuros, of course, when the Jesuits arrived in 1581, they established the Colegio de Manila in 1595, October. So they followed the same curriculum that was followed in Europe, in Spain at that time, which was to have a few years for primary school, primary education, which is of course usually reading, writing, and I think there is a certain level of mathematics, but very limited. And then after this first few years in what is the equivalent of primary school today, you would have the grammar school, which would be higher, and this would consist of about 5 years of study, 3 years studying Latin. You might want to ask why Latin, because Latin is the language of the common language, not only of Christianity, but also the higher educational institutions in Europe at that time, including Spain. And so if you want to pursue a career in government or especially in law, you would have to learn Latin. And if you want to pursue a career as a priest, you would also learn Latin, because both the church and the state would be dependent on Roman law, especially Spain, which was under the Romans. So Roman law, you would need a basic knowledge of Latin. So 3 years of Latin grammar, 1 year of Latin poetry, and 1 year of rhetoric. I think that's debate. And this basically was the curriculum all the way up to the standardization of secondary schools in the 19th century, the second half of the 19th century. And then, of course, that's for the primary, and then the secondary school, then you would have what is called philosophy or the arts, no? The arts, sometimes referred to as the arts, where you would also have, aside from philosophy, the subjects of metaphysics, epistemology, etc. There would be mathematics, there would be the social sciences, and this would be already in the higher levels, entering equivalent to the first years of the university. So I hope I answered your question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. De Castro. Okay. By the way, that question came from an anonymous attendee. No? He or she did not identify himself or herself. Anyway, so thank you for that question, Mr. or Miss Anonymous Attendee. Okay. So our next question is for Dr. Jose. Okay, from Mr. Mark Vincent Nogra. Thank you for a very detailed presentation po. How did the Spaniards construct these structures? Were they products of Polo y Servicio?
Thank you for the question. I myself, I'm not too sure about construction methods. And I also am not sure when Polo y Servicio was instituted. I know that by the 18th and the 19th centuries, there was Polo y Servicio. But I'm talking about earlier constructions. So I don't know how they carry this out. But, by Polo y Servicio, that would mean people are given, are required some time to serve for government projects. At that time, the church was also part of the church and state were together. So I know that in the 19th century, such as in Bohol, in the later times, if a priest would like to have his church constructed faster, apart from his regular workers, he would ask for the polistas to help. And I know that, for example, in Cavite, the polistas were given food. No? They were not paid. I think the wages are a different concept, but they were given food and tobacco and lambanog yata, basi. But these are mentioned in the expense accounts. But for the 17th and early 18th centuries, I do not have material for that. But however, I would like to give the early Filipinos that they had a will to build the church, because they could also. There are many times when Filipinos did not like to build the church. They would leave. They would vanish into the forest, and therefore naiwan ng pare na wala siyang kasama. So I would like to think that the Filipinos, when they wanted to build the church, they would carry it out, and so the issue of forced labor would not really be pertinent to this certain construction. Not all, no. I'm not saying, I'm not giving a general statement, but the fact that the churches are there means that the Filipinos at the time work together to build the church.
May I
Thank
say
you, sir.
something? May I say something, Noy?
Yes, Ma'am Eloisa.
Just to add, because from the Jesuit sources that I read, especially for Leyte, and of course Samar, according to Father Colin, no matter how many times, because starting in 1603, I think Buwisan, the Moros started to attack, invade the Visayas, Samar, Leyte, Bohol, etc. And according to him, no matter how many times, many of the towns were reduced to cinders and burned. He said the townspeople always came back, at least for Leyte and Samar, always came back and rebuilt the town, rebuilt the chapel, the school. They always came back. So no matter how many times, how many people were carried away, the survivors would always come back. And I think that says something a lot about the Filipinos, the natives.
Okay, so thank you, Ma'am Eloisa. Okay. And Sir Ricky. Our next question is for Dr. Concepcion, although I think she has already answered this by messaging the person who raised this question. But for the sake of all the participants, okay, so the question is from Mr. Lamberto Pilatan Jr. Good morning po, Ma'am Concepcion, Dr. Concepcion. Is it true that native Filipinos' lands were grabbed, or inagaw by Spanish friars that led to the revolution of the Filipinos?
Yeah, I think that idea especially surfaced in the 18th century, with the Tagalog revolts. Ang nangyari, parang hindi sila nagkalabuan na because I think it was especially mga Dominican lands, and I suppose Augustinian lands kasi Bulacan. So what happened was the descendants of the natives who were supposed to have sold or donated lands in the previous centuries were now contesting the pledge of their ancestors to the religious order. So ang sabi ng mga Tagalog noong 18th century, inagaw sa kanila yung mga lupa. But then, if you are also wondering about the case of Calamba, I think medyo iba naman yun. So I will refer you to, but that idea of the friars grabbing land actually fed the natives' anger, and so against the friars. So obviously that led to their angst, and which fueled the revolution. Pero I think we have to nuance it, yung sinasabing land grabbing, looking at the sources, not just from the 18th century, but from the previous centuries, to establish who actually owned the land and how it was passed on from the native owners or the native settlers to the religious orders. Yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Ma'am Grace. Okay, for our next question for Dr. De Castro. This is again from our active participant, Mr. Nogra. Thank you for a concise presentation po. I am curious po as to how the friars prepared themselves in the process of evangelization. Given the wide cultural differences between the natives and friars, how did the latter manage to equip themselves with the tools and expertise to deliver instruction?
Thank you for the question. Actually, there were no standardized methodologies at that time. That would come in the 19th century, very late 19th century to the 20th century. No, so these friars, some of them came to the Philippines not yet ordained as priests, but deacons. Or some of them even finished here and finished their philosophy, their theology, and then were ordained in the Philippines. So they would go by their own experience. And what would be their experience? The experience in Spain. How did they attain their education in Spain? And so that became their basic foundation to teaching, no? And then many of them had experience, especially the older ones who volunteered to the missions in the Philippines. Some of them had experience teaching in the seminaries in Spain. And so they would have they would have more experience. And so therefore, I would think that they would have be more effective because of their experience. Then, of course, after the 1582 Synod of Manila, when the native languages were required for evangelization, the missionaries had to learn the languages. No, I think Ricky mentioned something about that in the Missioneros Dominicans, no, where there would be Tagalistas, there would be maybe not the other day, no, but there would be people who would specialize in Tagalog, for example. So they would be referred to as Tagalistas. So they would definitely be sent to the Tagalog areas, no, like Bataan. You would have Bulacan, Cavite, and then you would have the ones who would volunteer for the Cagayan missions would definitely have to learn Ibanag, no, and then you have the ones for Pangasinan, of course, the Pangasinense language. No? So they had to prepare themselves. In fact, some of them were outstanding in the sense that I think Father Miguel de Benavides, the founder of UST, was outstanding for having learned not one of the native languages, but Chinese, I think Hokkien, in 3 months. And then I think I'm not sure if it's Father Diego Aduarte, but one of the pioneer missionaries also learned Tagalog in 3 months. No, so this is how they prepared themselves in order to be able to communicate with the natives.
Thank you, Ma'am Eloisa. And Sir Ricky would like to add something, no, regarding that issue.
Yeah, thank you. The question on the language, friars learning the language can be made actually a scientific study because at least for the Dominicans, I mentioned the acts of the chapters. The chapters were held every 2 years, and then eventually in the latter part of the 17th and then throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, they also nominated a person to examine the missionaries who were going to the missions. So they had a person assigned for the Ibanag, they had a person for the Tagalog who would examine the prospective missionary. So we can make a list of who are these language experts and then follow them up in the biographies prepared by Father Othio, and then compare them with a bibliography of what they had written. So we can see the tandem of the development of the written development of the language versus the teaching of the language through the missionary. So that can be there's available material for that. May I go back to the and also we have the dictionaries. So we have handwritten dictionaries, manuscripts in the archives, and we have not only just Gadang, Ibanag, Ivatan, but also Tagalog. You will remember that a few years ago, Ateneo published the Dictionary of Tagalog, which had a blue ang cover noon by Juan de San Antonio Franciscan, of which there are, I think, 3 versions. One is in Vienna, I think, but the other one is in UST. And this was proof that they were learning the Tagalog language at that time. This is, I think, one of the earliest Tagalog manuscripts that we have.
Yes, thank you, Sir Ricky. Okay, and there's another question for Sir Ricky regarding the conservation of structures. So this comes from Mr. Alfie Antonino Dama. Okay. What efforts are made to conserve or restore this cultural heritage, especially the dilapidated churches in Cagayan?
Thank you. I think that's a significant question. That's also one reason why I chose the topic for this nationwide conference, to bring attention these ruins, which are many times they're not noticed because they're so difficult to get to. For example, Fuga and Tabang, Malaweg, at the time I was studying them, ang hirap na puntahan. I think Malawag is easier now to go to, but still, there have been a number of efforts to call attention to the importance of the heritage. The NCCA has held several workshops for the conservation of these churches. And I'd like also to thank here the Archdiocese of Tuguegarao and the clergy of Pangasinan, who have helped me themselves in facilitating visits to these churches, and their hospitality has been unparalleled. However, there is still much to convince the people that these places are important landmarks in our evolution as a society. It's very slow. The documents are not easily available because most of them are in Spanish. So that's why we should really learn, or some of us should be learning more Spanish to get to the documents. For Tocolana, the mayor in Lalo has now made a road from the highway leading to the cemetery, which is Tocolana. So that's a good sign now. It's more accessible. Before you would have to cross over several tombs just to get to the place, but now they have cleared it. So the danger now, I think, is now that we know the churches are there, is that we might overdo the conservation. Baka polish the stone, put in stained glass, or put in bathroom tiles, which are not appropriate to the structure. So all of these must go through what we call in UST a conservation management plan, which is a very academic study, so that we will know how to scientifically conserve these churches. It's a multidisciplinary and multi-societal function.
Thank you, Sir Ricky. Okay, I'm reviewing some of the questions. There are several more questions here, although it's almost 12 o'clock. Okay, so, there is a question for Dr. Concepcion, but I think she has tried to answer it through, she's typing her answer to the center.
Good. For lack of time po, nasa answered part siya, yung mga questions.
Yeah. So this has something to do with yung sa land ownership pa rin. No? So anyway, I think she has answered some of this. Thank you for that, Ma'am Grace. Okay, so there's a question here. The Tagalog revolts. Most of them are farmers, or those who were involved were farmers. They wanted their lands back, taken by the friars. Is it true? Okay. So probably the question is about the Tagalog revolts. Can you tell us more about the Tagalog revolts?
Naku, Tagalog revolts. Ang layo kasi ng topic ko, 1 century before. So pasensya na po, I am not so familiar with all the details. But then when the revolts that started in, Cavite, kasama sumama ng Laguna, para po siyang it was like a forest fire that spread throughout the Tagalog region, especially in areas that were evangelized by the Dominicans. Kasama na po dun yung Jesuits, kaya lang yung Jesuits parang hindi masyadong napahamak kasi they were exiled, di ba? So the lands that they previously owned, I think passed to the Dominicans, correct me if I'm wrong, or the Augustinians. So yung mga na-involved doon were land-owning religious orders, which were the Augustinians, the Recollects, and the Dominicans. So as I said earlier, some native leaders contested the ownership of their of the lands that they used to that they claimed that they had, that they owned. So and ayun yung discourse, that were grabbed by the friars. So ang ginawa ng government was to send the audiencia sent delegates to examine the claims of both parties. So ganun uli, the Spaniards, ang nangyari, ang nakikita ko ganito, before they pass a sentence to a judgment on a case, they usually send delegates from the audiencia to interview the parties involved, and so they interviewed the significant witnesses to see sino ba talagang may-ari ng lupa, no? But then for yung conclusion medyo hanging, but kasi nga I think ang nangyari, nagkaroon ng mga conflicting ideas on ownership, and that's why because of those conflicting ideas which started even before that, yung century prior to the 18th century land revolts, Tagalog revolts, nagkaroon ng mga misunderstanding compounded throughout the century. And so, pasensya na po, hindi ko may bibigay lahat ng details, but I will refer you instead to an article on this. It is open access sa Philippine Studies on the Tagalog revolts. If you email me, I have my email on my PowerPoint, or check the recording. It's grace.concepcion@uap.asia. I will send you the link to that article. So, ayun po, para mabasa nyo yung mga details. Thank you.
Thank you, Ma'am Grace. Actually, there are several more questions here, and some of these are addressed to Dr. Donoso, who cannot. I just hope that he's here with us now, but I think it's only around 6 a.m. in Spain. So we have to, still sleeping probably. Okay, so it's almost 12 o'clock. So I'm glad that Dr. Concepcion has already shared her email address for probably some other participants would like to ask more questions. Okay. You can, for those questions which were not answered, apologies, due to time constraints. We cannot accommodate all of, we cannot answer all of those questions. Okay? Anyway, you may keep in touch probably with our distinguished speakers. Okay? So before I close this session, okay, let's have some final words from our conference convener, Dr. Churchill.
Okay, thank you very much to all the speakers and to our moderator and all the people behind the scenes. I have a very short comments. because I don't really have the time. I just want to point out, the importance of the Boxer Codex. I was privileged to be able to view the original Boxer Codex in the Lilly Library. And it was some kind of an experience because the minute I requested for the copy, the library was closed. Nobody could enter the library until my husband and I finished. So that's how precious that book was. And I opened every single page of that with my gloved hands. So I'm very happy with that. One other matter I'd like to point out, there has been a new study on the location of Mai. I see Goban 1 has pointed out that it is probably not in Mindoro, but probably somewhere in the Bai area. If you recall, Pila was a big center for excavation of porcelain and other materials. So that's one. And on the matter of Brunei, when I was working on Batangas with the Laurels, Doy Laurel specifically, he gave me, Ocelia Diaz Laurel gave me a copy of a biography or ancestry book of the Laurels, where the Doy Laurel pointed out the relation of his ancestor to Brunei. So that's it. Now I just want to share these little tidbits with you because I thought that they were interesting and they're part of my life. So I'd like to close officially this session, and I can't do that by just turning off my computer. So on behalf of the PNHS Board of Trustees, I would like to extend my heartfelt thanks and appreciation to the National Historical Commission of the Philippines for the invitation to participate in this once-in-a-lifetime international conference spanning several months. Supposed to start on October 20, it will end on December 17. Celebrating and commemorating 500 years of historic relations of Spain and the Philippines, 1521-2021. There is no question the lasting legacy which has resulted from this long period for both the Philippines and Spain. The Quincentennial has afforded us the opportunity to reflect on the Christianity that has evolved and developed among us through the generations, and more significantly for us to look back at our history to retrace our ancestors' response to Spanish colonialism in terms of acceptance as well as resistance, which ended after 333 years of imperial rule. We have seen the consequences of both acceptance and resistance to colonial rule interface in the strong indigenous belief system among the indigenous peoples and those who had converted to Islam. The international conference featured an impressive lineup of speakers to address a wide range of historiographic and bibliographic presentations. Noteworthy is the attention given to the society and culture of the peoples of this nation of islands. This apparently was an expression from Magellan at the time of contact in 1521 with the Magellan expedition. Magellan found in these islands a many-layered place, a plural society with rich cultural traditions attesting to Austronesian roots and a rich maritime history in its natural setting in Southeast Asia. The subsequent layering of Spanish European culture and traditions will allow us to re-envision the history, culture, and heritage of Filipinas, including forgotten and or other histories missed or glossed over in the national narrative. PNHS is honored to have been able to bring up new and more historical studies to fill the gaps, as well as to enrich previously known history and cultural heritage. There is no question of the value of history and cultural heritage in celebrating the history of our people and defining our identity, and hopefully restore a common purpose to country and people. We are living in the unprecedented circumstance of the novel coronavirus global epidemic. We are presently surviving in this contradictory reality of social distancing and masking. living in a bubble as we sheltered in place in loneliness and boredom in enforced quarantine and lockdowns. What we should probably do during this pandemic is to take the opportunity for self-reflection during the lockdown and to think how best to adapt our new realities, but still keeping the traditions of the past, the before pandemic time, while we prepare to meet the after pandemic time. The pandemic notwithstanding, historians do not stop nor give up history and tradition because of a pandemic. These days, we deal with wall-to-wall Zoom seminars, endless virtual life, which at times could be terrifying for me especially. Historians now and in the future will have to untangle and unravel these times. History is vital to giving us perspective, knowing where humans failed before and where they prevailed in the worst public health crisis in a century. History will enrich understanding of the world around us and help us shape the things to come in the post-pandemic. I would like to leave you with a message that would be hopeful for a future when the world will be delivered from the pandemic. We can only wish for the future as we sing songs of comfort and pray hard that we will all survive. Show some love. We will be fine. I would like to express my deepest thanks and appreciation to the National Historical Commission of the Philippines and to our to all of you, but also especially to the technical team of NHCP. Alec, Paulette, Jonelle, and Ian, and everybody there. Major thanks from PNHS and major thanks. Congratulations to NHCP and to all of us. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Dr. Churchill. So with that, we end the panel B of session 3 of the Philippine International Quincentennial Conference. It is now 12:06 p.m. Philippine Standard Time, 12:06 a.m. in Washington, D.C.
That's me. It's worth staying up. I was very happy to be with you all, including the people who are not seen. Can I see Paulette and Alec and Jonelle and whoever else is behind the scene for one last time before we say goodbye? Pwede ba? Ayaw yatang magpakita. Where are you? Ah, there you go. There you go. Where are the others? Saan yung iba? Okay, well, thank you very much. Pasensya na, Alec, at marami akong problema dito sa webinar na ito. Mahirap sa buhay ko ito. But thank you very much to all of you for working so hard. Lahat kayo na nasa litrato. Actually, may nangyari dito sa screen ko kasi meron ako na pindot. Lumiit yung screen ko, but I can still see you. Thank you. Okay.
Salamat, Noy.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Close ko na po. Sandali. We invite everyone to catch the next sessions. Okay. So session 4 will be on November 11, convened by my home department, the DLSU Department of History. I will also be the same moderator.
Baka ma-confuse sila.
Okay. I will be the moderator for Panel A on November 11, on Thursday. Session 5 will be on November 15 to 16, convened by love ko rin to. My first love, UP Los Baños, where I began my teaching career. And November 17, to be convened by the MSU IIT Department of History. Okay, so you can catch the live stream on the Facebook pages flashed on your screen, or join us here in the Zoom for first come, first served basis by registering at www.nqc.gov.ph/PIQC. This has been your moderator, Noy Makapindak from the DLSU Department of History. Thank you and have a good day.